Hello, world. So hi, this is I'm Simon Manley, British Permanent Representative to WTO, and I'd like to welcome you all, whether you are online or here in Geneva, in what is rather akin, to those of you who are not here in Geneva, rather akin to a padded cell, which I hope doesn't reflect on the organisation's perceptions of our distinguished panel. We are now here. So look, welcome everybody to this session on accelerating the race to net zero by using trade policy to support trade in low carbon goods. Very timely discussion. One of the big themes, of course, of this week in the lead up to COP26 in Glasgow. I promise I shall make no references to Kermit the Frog in this session. But look, we are approaching a decisive moment for international efforts to tackle the climate crisis. This is indeed the great challenge of our times. The UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, you all know, has said that man-made CO2 emissions need to fall by about 45% by 2030 from 2010 levels, and they recently reached net zero by mid-century if we are to give our planet any chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade and avoiding the worst impacts of climate change, impacts I think we've already been living through just this summer. And we've seen the effects that they can have, whether that be in California and Western Canada, in New York City, or here in continental Europe. And the number of countries that have pledged to reach net zero emissions by 2050 does continue to grow, which is the good news. So by April of this year, 44 countries plus the entire European Union had pledged to meet net zero emission targets. That's about 68% of the global economy, 56% of the global population, more than 4 billion people, and about 60% of greenhouse gas emissions. However, we also know that those pledges by governments to date, even if fully achieved, fall well short of what is required to bring global energy-related CO2 emissions to net zero by 2050 and give the world an even chance of limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. So what can be done to accelerate the race to net zero? And in particular, and this is the big issue here, sitting in the WTO, how can trade policy, traditionally seen as a contributor to climate change, not as a way to manage climate change, support the race to net zero? So supporting me and joining me to discuss the challenge of our times are three extraordinarily distinguished and knowledgeable people, which is great. So you don't have to listen to me offer my own views on this subject. And to my left, I have Jean-Marie Pogam, Director General Adjoint, Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization, the OMC, since early this year. And before this, he was the extraordinarily distinguished permanent representative of nos chers confrères, La France, here at l'OMC. So delighted to have you here with us, Jean-Marie. And to my right, I have Caroline Dier-Birkbeck, Director on the Forum on Trade, Environment and the SDGs. Here, it's a Director of the Forum on Trade, which is a partnership between the Graduate Institute in Geneva and the UN Environmental Programme, UNEP. Caroline, it's great to have you with us again. She's getting slightly sick at the sight of me since she does too many of these panels with me, but and kind of behind, above, around, online, I have Rain Newton-Smith, Chief Economist of the Confederation of British Industry, the CBI, joining us from London. So thank you very much, Rain, as well, for joining us this afternoon. So we are going to sort of kick off with interventions from our three panelists, and then we're going to try and open things up to debate with the questions from the floor, or a little bit of exchange between the panelists. So with no further ado, I was going to turn to Jean-Marie to kick us off. There's obviously a lot of talk about whether we could launch something here akin to the environmental goods agreement negotiations as part of the trade environmental sustainability structure discussions. How do you see the prospects kind of within the WTO and particularly ahead, of course, of MC12? Jean-Marie.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your warm welcome. It's a pleasure to be there. It's also extremely rewarding to see that we are being mobilized by the British industry and by the industry in general. But to be fair, I'm not fully surprised, because the more I'm working on this subject, the more I realize how the private sector is way ahead of us, public institutions, and especially international organizations, in terms of starting to deal with the green transition, in terms of innovation and in general corporate social responsibility. So we have something to learn, and I thank the CBI for organizing the event. I think this is very, what I just said about the private sector is very representative of what I call, I like, being French, I like the abstraction. So the change of paradigm or business model, you like it, you name it as you prefer, which is happening in the relation between trade and environment. And this change has two dimensions. The first one is, which are very important, very relevant for the WTO. The first one is that from the trade perspective, environment has always been seen as a cost or an obstacle to trade. And now it's becoming the opposite. It's the unsustainable trade, which is becoming an obstacle to the economic growth. So this is something which is changing all around the place. I'll come later with more specifics on this. The second element is the legal mirror of this economic vision of environment as a cost. It was seen historically in the WTO as an exception. Environment was an exception to trade. Of course, we recognize the superiority of the environmental value. So it's justified to restrict trade on behalf of the environment, but it's just outside of the system. And now more and more, the outside world is turning to trade policy, and the WTO included, with the idea of trade should be a solution to the environment, should bring positive contribution to the solution of environmental problem. This is extremely important, and this is happening everywhere. The private sector already mentioned. I should mention green finance, which is also leading a little bit of the change here. No matter if there is greenwashing on the roads, there is not only greenwashing, there is a little bit of communication, but also changes in the business models. Trade policy is not immune to that. And if you take the EU trade policy, now it entails it in its unilateral instruments, such as trade preferences, and also bilateral instruments such as FTAs, very substantial sustainable provision chapters. And this is not only true for the EU. It's we have an account of, I think in the WTO we have identified 270 treaties which have those trade and sustainable development provision. So this is massive. Now, the EGA environmental goods agreement or project of agreement that you have been referring to, Mr. Ambassador, has been one of the most interesting illustration of this change of paradigm, because it was a win-win type of solution between trade and the environment. How can you promote the dissemination of technologies favorable to the environment just by lowering tariffs and non-tariff measures? And the work started on this in 2014 in Davos, actually not far from here, with a group of WTO members which focused on this prospect. There was 18 participants in 2016, representing 46 WTO members, and they came out with a list of 265 environmental goods. What was interesting is that there was, you can have a theological debate about what is an environmental good, but at least listing it is the first way to try to operationally act. And it was based on some previous work from the APEC. Unfortunately, this group did not reach consensus, and the work has been, should I say, stopped or frozen? It's not exactly clear. Now, what is happening is that three trends are impacting this idea of liberalizing trade on environmental goods. The first one is clearly we see a strong appetite from part of our members to restart this negotiation, to restart this win-win logic. And some of them are gathering under the banner of what we call TEST, which is a plurilateral dialogue launched by some members. TEST the acronym standing for Trade and Sustainable Development, structured discussion in the WTO. So appetite to restart. Second element, there is a significant interest from several of our members to somehow try to reformat, not only rebrand, really reformat this negotiation under environmental good liberalization to a climate change goods, trade in goods liberalization. That would be, instead of selecting all the wide scope of environmental goods with the supposition that we can really limit the scope, just focus that on climate change as a priority. And the third trend is the part of our group of our members, which is suggesting why should we limit us to goods and why not out trade in services, which is of course a very relevant question, since many services are helping directly to fight climate change. And we know that also in the realm of goods, there are many services which are integrated under the good banner. So that's another focus. And in our Committee on Trade and Services, there are even propositions to liberalize services with a relation to climate change. Now, this is the state of play here. Beyond this idea of liberalization, of win-win, there are other ideas which could, of course, be very complementary by mobilizing other trade policy instruments in favor of a low carbon economy. There is, for instance, a discussion on plastic, another one on fossil fuel subsidy reform, and they all these initiatives play with how can we use trade policy instruments such as transparency. Transparency is really the pillar of this organization, and the first trade policy instrument, it's important to know what the countries are doing to try to foster international cooperation. Subsidies, of course, another very classical trade angle, and standard setting. The WTO is not by itself a standard setting organization, but you know that all our technical committees strongly recommend to our members to rely in their policies on international standards, which are being set in some organizations such as ISO or that. So these are different approaches that I'm just alluding to in order not to be too long. And well, here we are, and back to you, Ambassador. Thank you.
Monsieur le Directeur Général Adjoint, cher Jean-Marie, merci. Thank you very much indeed. I'd warmly endorse what you said, first of all, about the inspiration from business and how actually business is perhaps a little bit ahead of some of us in sort of government on many of these issues, but also your very practical suggestions about how we can take this forward and where ambition might lie within the WTO. So thank you very much for kicking us off in such fine style, if I may say. Caroline, I turn to you. Look, you've heard from Jean-Marie about the perspective of the WTO itself. Where do you see the scope for a kind of WTO initiative around climate and trade? And what do you think we could include? And as Jean-Marie said, not just in terms of liberalizing trade in green goods, but also green services as well. Given that the kind of the boundaries between goods and services is now becoming quite so obscure.
Excellent. Great. Well, thank you very much, Ambassador. And let me thank you also and co-hosts here for the invitation to be here today. It's really a pleasure. And also great to see the UK and UK business working on this agenda and really trying to find ways forward. I think the UK has something of a unique credibility because you have made efforts unilaterally to liberalize your tariffs on certain environmental goods. So to answer your question, I'm going to focus firstly around the environmental goods and services agenda. Of course, Jean-Marie has already mentioned that there are several elements of the climate and trade agenda that could be dealt with at the WTO. Obviously, there's fossil fuel subsidy reform. There's issues around collaboration around climate standards and understanding some of the challenges related to those and the opportunities. But I'll focus mostly on this issue of environmental goods and services. And here, just some reflections on how we frame this agenda. because I think it's really important that whilst the agenda today is focused on decarbonizing trade and supply chains, it's also really important that we remember that we can also look at trade in goods and services that will help climate adaptation. And I think for developing countries, this is a really, really critical piece that they may be interested in this space, especially those that are bearing the brunt of climate impacts. Also beyond decarbonization, the push for greener trade is not only about promoting trade in green goods and services, but trying to make all trade green. So we need to keep that as our, as our larger goal here. Otherwise, we get into sort of it kind of becoming very cute. We kind of promote a few products here and a few products there, whereas what we really want to do is help to transform. And I think here one of the flip sides of this liberalization of trading goods and services agenda is that we also have existing tariff structures that are biased towards dirty industries, so that we have lower tariffs and lower trade barriers on dirty goods. So it's not just a matter of bringing down the green ones, it's about what do we do with these ones that, a lot of carbon intensive goods can flow very cheaply across borders. So that's a sort of a flip side of it that we need to bear in mind. The other thing I think is important just around framing is that it's quite possible that the language of decarbonizing can be limiting. I mean, on the climate front, we also want to have nature positive trade. So you have this idea like decarbonized trade in agricultural commodities like meat and soy can sound very appealing, and yet at the same time they can be produced in ways that are really disastrous from a range of other environmental standpoints, and also in terms of land conversion and deforestation. So I think that, I mean, the decarbonization language is great because we all need a short headline, but it doesn't necessarily capture, a decarbonized plus nature positive trade, or one that also serves climate adaptation, I think is a framing that it may appeal to more countries and better reflect the real challenges that we face, because the Paris agenda is also both about mitigation and about adaptation. A second point, and there are others here who are far more expert on this than me, but Jean-Marie alluded to, is that I think the modern environmental goods and services discussion, it recognizes that many environmental goods require environmental services in order for them to be operated, maintained, and used over time. And also that we need to look at non-tariff barriers along with tariffs. So it's not just a question of reducing tariff barriers and all these goods will flow internationally. And I think related to that, it's really important that we bear in mind that for many countries, it's also not simply a matter of importing the technologies, it's about being able to adapt and use them in local contexts. So there's sort of a know-how aspect to that. There's a technology transfer aspect to that. There's also an issue around investment and financing so that you can actually bring these into your production processes. So it's a bigger package than just saying we're going to liberalize the tariffs. And I think to your question around sort of how we can move this at the WTO, I think it's this broader perspective on this that is really one that will enable us to engage a wider part of the WTO membership on this issue. So whilst I know there's a lot of excitement and pressure and interest in launching, being able to have a headline that says we've launched new negotiations on climate goods and services, in reality, what we probably really need to do is build up this picture of what are we talking about in terms of delivering something credible that would actually mean that we can assure that there really will be new climate technologies used in supply chains, put into production processes around the world, and that this will require a lot of work to work out how to do that in a way that appeals to a broad part of the WTO membership. So just quickly on that point, I wanted to note that there are developing countries who are really interested in this agenda. Many of them need environmental goods and services to help them respond and adapt to climate impacts. Many face pressures to decarbonize exports and production in order to compete in supply chains and in international markets. In the words of the ITC, which works here in Geneva with MSMEs in developing countries, there are a growing number of businesses in developing countries that recognize they need to be green to compete. And they recognize they can get a higher profit margin by competing in green supply chains and providing green products. But they also face a huge range of challenges. In our countries, governments are putting huge amounts of money into green industrial policies. I know the UK came up with a green industrial policy in 2020. The EU and the US are poised to put billions of dollars into R&D, government procurement, subsidies, investment, and so on to build their green industries in order to be competitive in this new greener economy. And the challenge is for developing countries is how can they also build their own capacity to compete in this. As I said, many want to have these, use these products in order to compete, but they also want to build their own industries, and build their own sectors and to be able to compete here. And so I think the challenge for us in thinking about the environmental goods and services discussion is how can we make sure that there's enough in it for them? The value of a negotiation is always to understand the interests of your negotiating partner and to find a landing zone that will be one that delivers something for them. And so I think that's really where we stand on these issues at the moment, is how to, I can see Ron is shaking his head back there, who's an expert on trade and environmental goods and services. So we'll have to get his opinion as well. But I think I can probably shut there, but just to say, I think that there is a lot of engagement and interest in this topic. I think that we will inevitably have something in the ministerial statement on promoting environmental goods and services. I think that language will be in there. The challenge will be how to put that into action after the ministerial and to really get some countries to engage. But I do think we have a lot of work to do in analysis of what really will make a difference, both for the environment and also for developing countries.
Carolyn, look, thank you for that. And I have to say, I think it would be unconscionable, actually, if ministers were to meet here in Geneva, but weeks after COP26, and they didn't actually address the issue of climate change. It would just make it look as if we were living in a parallel universe to the one inhabited by the rest of our fellow citizens. So I agree with you. And look, and thank you for the challenge. Actually, thank you for kind of challenging me back and my rather narrow-minded view kind of about what this is all about, because I think that's precisely right. We have to kind of actually challenge some of our preconceptions in the way that we have previously looked at this, notions of what are actually kind of green goods and services. And as you say, fundamental piece here is about shaking his head again at the back, about greening trade more generally, greening the economy. This reminds me that I am looking to our participants in the room and online to give us questions, comments, challenge.
Turn to Rain.
And we are going to turn to Rain.
Okay.
Don't worry. I'm
a control freak. I'm sorry.
But this is precisely this point, thank you, Carolyn, that I'm going to turn to Rain, who's been sitting there very patiently in London, waiting for us. Look, I mean, you heard the challenge there, Rain, from Carolyn, and indeed the kind of the thoughts of Jean-Marie before about how we can address these issues here. As chief economist of Britain's leading business organisation, I mean, kind of where do you kind of come out on this? What's business looking for in this area? As Jean-Marie said, in many ways, business and business organisations are outstripping the discussions here in WTO and elsewhere. So, word.
Yes, thank you, Ambassador. And look, I'm only really sorry that I couldn't join you in person. In fact, this panel a couple of years ago at the WTO forum was, I think, one of my last trips outside of the UK. I think, Ambassador, to sort of answer your question, I think what what businesses really want to see, and I guess starting where Jean-Marie started from, I do think businesses are really taking action, but I think we really want to change the narrative and be clear that trade is part of the solution on climate. And I think, look, no one is underestimating the scale of the challenge that's facing us. We know to sort of make our Paris Agreement commitments, we need to keep global warming at 1.5 degrees. And that means reducing global emissions from 55 gigatons per year to around 30 gigatons over the next decade. And so we need action in every sector and every country to deliver that. And, at the CBI, we represent 190,000 businesses across sectors and regions in the UK. And when I talk to those businesses, they really see it's important that we have that action and that we are doing everything we can to deliver reducing our carbon emissions and having the policies to deliver that. And I think there's two really important principles that stand out to me. And one is that we absolutely need to work with markets to deliver this transition. That is one of the ways in which we've seen success. If you look at the development of offshore wind and how that has transformed certainly the amount of energy in the UK that is driven by renewable energies, that was the government's working with the private sector to set out a regulatory framework that enabled the market to help to deliver some of those new technologies. And I think the second big principle is that trade is a fundamental part of the solution. And I think sometimes we're in danger of thinking, we need to buy local and that's the only way that we can reduce carbon emissions. But we know that if you want to, flowers grown in Kenya and then transported to the UK, even taking into account the emissions that happen in that transportation, they've got much lower embodied carbon emissions than, flowers grown in a greenhouse in the Netherlands. Of course, someone will say, of course, growing flowers in your back garden is probably the best solution. But look, there's many technologies you can't grow in your back garden. In our own home, we've recently installed an air source heat pump. That, the components that go into that technology, which now means our home is heated by a renewable energy source, that is part of a vast global supply chain, and it stems from innovations that have come through partnerships between business and governments around the world that have helped to develop these new technologies. And I think where the business community is at is they absolutely want to see COP26 be successful. They want every country to pull together to set the most ambitious targets to reduce carbon emissions and the credible plans to deliver that. But I think then they are really looking to the ministerial at the WTO, which follows in November, to ensure that we have trade in green technologies to unlock those plans and that trade remains free and fair. And I really echo what Carolyn was saying, that we need to have mechanisms for low-income countries to access the finance and support they need to make the transition to a low-carbon economy. But I really think we need to have the narrative that business is part of the solution, and that trade is so important to delivering that transition. And I think at the ministerial at the end of November, we really have to kickstart the negotiations on that environmental goods agreement, and we need to make sure that environmental goods are competing on a level playing field with non-environmental goods, because we've seen success in previous rounds at the WTO mean that many non-environmental products are zero tariff based, and yet they're competing against some of the newer technologies which have a tariff associated. And so we need to absolutely make that a level playing field. We just can't have a situation where an oil related product is zero rated and then we have wind turbine components which have substantial tariffs. And it's really part of something, we talk in the UK about the need to green our tax system, and I really think we need to green our trading system. And I think, we were really fortunate this year as the UK hosting the G7. We hosted the B7 and worked with our sister federations, the business organizations across the G7 countries and beyond. And, we published a paper around climate as part of that. And we really called on that November ministerial to really kickstart those trade negotiations and importantly update the list of eligible goods and services that have an environmental component, and obviously agreeing that list does seem to be one of the biggest challenges to getting an overall agreement. And I also really echo what Carolyn was saying about we need to look at some of the tariff barriers, and that trade and services is also a really important part of this. And in some sense, the environmental design and about how we build buildings that are zero carbon, there's expertise in that lies in so many different countries, and we need to allow those experts to be able to move and provide that advice to a range of countries, and particularly in low-income countries. So I suppose, the biggest hope I have, and from the business community, is that we just have a really clear message that trade is part of the solution, that we need, this is a global problem which needs global solutions, and that the WTO and other multilateral organizations are really at the heart of reaching a progressive global agreement. So we just hope that negotiations, are really kick-started to having a really high level of ambition. And I think that's going to take every single one of us across business and government in every country working together to really deliver that.
Ray, thank you very much for that really insightful sort of intervention. Look, I'm certainly an advocate of believing that trade has to be part of the solution, not the problem, in terms of greening the global economy and reaching net zero. And I think you're right about the kind of holistic nature of the response that we require. That's all about greening trade, about greening tax, about greening our daily lives. We've got some really good questions coming in, and I have two before me, one of which is, what role can trade in environmental green services have in supporting the development of markets within developing nations and encouraging them to be fully engaged, which I think picks up on points that both Carolyn and Rain, and I was actually talking about that example of Kenyan flour production to a British MP just earlier today, Rain. It's very, very timely. But I was going to turn actually to Karen, if I may, to pick up that first question. So what role can trade and environmental and green services have in supporting the development of markets within developing nations and encouraging them to be fully engaged? I'll take that, Karen. I have one for Jean-Marie in a second, so I'll come back to him in a moment.
That's a tricky one off the top of my head, but I will say there was something I was just as a slight side issue I was going to mention, is that the World Bank came out with a really interesting study yesterday, looking at opportunities for developing countries in sort of green trade, and how it would help both their decarbonization and climate adaptation efforts, and also support their development. And one of the useful facts that I have here is, it said there that if they did a tariff restructuring that was biased toward lower duties for high technology green sectors, that this would have significant payoffs, both in terms of emissions reductions and in terms of poverty rates. So in Bangladesh, they estimated that a green trade scenario where they would increase, they would actually increase tariff rates for non-climate friendly goods to 30%, but put all the other ones to zero, that it would actually it would be equivalent, it would produce the equivalent emissions to 53% of national emissions by 2040. So a really, really powerful thing by ensuring that they could bring these environmental goods into their economy. And that's, on a whole, this could be in energy efficiency and renewable energy technologies, a whole range of different goods. But I think on the services front, I guess, there just one example. I know with these various renewable energy technologies, and also with some of the technologies for monitoring climate conditions that are used by farmers in agricultural production and so on, that these are not, it's not simply the hardware that is needed, but it's the software to maintain, monitor the data, analyze the data, and so on. And that requires the provision of services related to these technologies. So that if they don't, I guess the key point with many of them is, if you don't have access to the adjacent services, then the technologies will not work so well. But I think I would probably defer to others to provide some better examples than I can off the top of my head.
Rain, do you have any better examples? Picking up that question about the role of trade, environmental and green services.
I don't know. I mean, I think Carolyn picked out some brilliant ones, but I think, you know, I guess starting from this point about, you know, there's that I was making earlier, there's so much sort of know-how in terms of how we build buildings. We know the built environment, right, is you know, whether that's thinking also about transport infrastructure, is a huge amount of carbon emissions in the UK and also globally, and how we build housing, how we build transport networks that are zero, you know, compliant with a sort of net zero world is a huge and growing area, and a lot of that requires expertise from different countries. So I think allowing you know, people to be able to move across borders to provide those services is so important. And I think, you know, it is true, even just thinking about, you know, the move to electric vehicles, there is so much of that is, and the way even we buy cars now, right? It's almost transportation as a service rather than just thinking about it as a good. And I think that principle applies globally as these newer technologies get rolled out and become, you know, more widespread. So I think that those are just sort of two examples that I think are really, you know, really important.
Having recently bought a car, Rain, it felt to me as if I was offered a series of different software packages, just happened to be in a large aluminium sort of box. So certainly beyond my software capabilities. Anyway, right, moving on swiftly. Jean-Marie, a really interesting question that's come in, which is, are you and your colleagues here in the Secretariat considering a global needs analysis focused on identifying the goods and services that would be needed to help the world transition from a carbon-based economy and liberalizing on that basis? That's a slightly leading question, I think, but is that on the agenda? And if not, how do we put it on the agenda?
I mean, the standard answer would be, we are a members-driven organization. No,
I'm a member. I'm driving.
Okay. As a straightforward answer, I'm not aware that we are doing that job. And it's true that it has been very difficult during the EGA negotiation to come out with lists. And there are very different ways of approaching the bare notion of environmental goods. And actually, this was one of the reasons of the failure. Because there was disagreement about a couple of goods which might have been integrating some competitiveness issues. So we are not, but I think it's a good suggestion. We could try to work on that with and talk with our colleagues of the OECD, which are also working quite well on this topic. That would be my best first answer. On the previous question, which was very tricky, I admit, I would just add one thing, is that I think to some extent we have to think, it's not a buzzword, we have to think of a South-South dimension in the exchange of services, because there is no reason that Karachi and Jakarta may not have found comparable solutions to comparable problems in waste management, in other kind of energy related issues. And I have in mind one example that I don't know so much, but I heard about is, some project with solar panel energy providing, connecting with mobile phones payments, which are solutions which are fully adapted to developing countries. So there is also the possibility of a trade between developing countries themselves to disseminate best practices in services. So with that,
All interesting. Can I just check if there are any questions or comments from anybody in the room? Thoughts, questions? Yes, please. Back there.
From the graduate institute, I worked with Dr. Caroline on this.
I don't think they're activated.
It's okay. I mean, my question was essentially on some of the political dynamics and processes, because I mean, you often hear, when you speak to a lot of the countries, say, well, I mean, of course, I mean, we do need environmental goods, but if you want to import them, we can do that autonomously anyway. We can lower tariffs or we can reduce barriers to services. So what would be needed for sort of a buy-in from the larger group of developing countries for a binding agreement, which, I mean, obviously they would lock in the tariffs, lock in non-tariff barriers, restrict, let's say, quote unquote policy space. What would be needed to sort of get countries on board to actually make that hard commitment? And the other thing related to it is, I mean, in addition to the WTO, we do have constituencies in these countries, including environment ministries that are implementing various sort of environmental projects. There's going to be industries, there's going to be pollution-related problems. What would industry groups and others, is there like sort of a bilateral consultation with these countries and with all these groups saying, well, I mean, these might be solutions to all these problems, some of these goods and services. And, maybe it could be trade, it could also be investment, it could be all. So really sort of bringing in all these other coalition diverse groups that are demanders for these goods and services, and then feeding that back into the WTO process and trade negotiation. Is there something like that happening? I mean, at a bilateral level or regional level, to other channels as well, like between the environment ministries or development ministries?
Thank you very much for that. So for those listening in, and I'm now going to horribly simplify and probably transform your question to a comments. But for those listening in, the interesting question was kind of reflecting that individual countries can obviously take autonomous measures to lower their own tariffs in respect of environmental goods and services if they want. But how do you kind of produce, if I may, I think the sense was kind of how do you win support, particularly amongst developing countries, for kind of more multilateral, plurilateral measures in the same sense? And secondly, kind of how do you, there's a lot of energy out there, a lot of ideas coming out of industry groups. To what extent are those sort of bilateral or sort of plurilateral initiatives amongst sort of industry groups kind of reflected and fed back into the system here in the WTO? Was there a second question or comment? No, from your.
Frankly feel. But this, of course, is, I know this is more just building some wall.
Well, thank you for the questions. Well, the two questions, I'm going to try and take a quick stab at both of them. I mean, the first thing is that we have to deal with it in the trade context, and we have to because there are thousands of businesses around the world who will not be able to decarbonize and meet their net zero targets unless they have access to cutting edge technologies, and they're not produced within their borders. So you know, it's sort of, you know, and there's an argument that, and I don't have the figures, so I won't make them up, but whatever energy transition you have seen around the world is partly because some of these renewable energy technologies like solar and wind, the prices have dropped. And a lot of that's because there's been greater international markets for them, and we've been able to expand them and ship them to more places around the world to put them in use. So, I mean, I think that trade does indeed have a critical role to play in helping us to decarbonize internationally. You know, the question I think then to Mahesh is, how do you get buy-in to that? Is I think we just have to look harder at how we just need to do more analysis with developing countries that really focuses on the specific challenges that they face. It may be around waste management, just not being able to cope with plastic waste, for example, or around climate adaptation. So what are the 3 problems you face? Is it port infrastructure collapsing because of hurricanes? Is it that you need, you know, new tools for agricultural production to withstand floods, droughts, pests, you know, whatever it is? We need to focus on the challenges that they face. And we can also find opportunities for them. So example, in the dialogue on plastics pollution that's underway at the WTO, which developing countries are key players in, they have identified that they would like to find opportunities to trade in non-plastic substitutes, which they have some advantages in natural fiber-based alternatives to plastics, for instance, for certain uses in packaging. They have also articulated that they really need to have more access to goods and services for waste management of plastic. So there is this positive agenda out there, but I think it's probably better if we target particular problems, and then we can make sure also that the list doesn't end up just being a random list of goods, but they're actually goods that have some environmental credibility in terms of solving the problems. And here I would just say that the more work we can do with environmental constituencies in countries who may be driving the demand, and environment ministries who are trying to meet environmental goals nationally, is really, really critical to this, and to working with small businesses that, again, if you listen to our colleagues from the ITC, they'll tell you they're often the most innovative in environmental issues in developing countries. So to find out from them, what do they need? And this may involve liberalization, it may involve importing, it may involve partnerships, access to finance, ways of providing, you know, local employment and training for people. But we've got to find an attractive package for them that makes sense also to their own development goals. I think a key thing around that will be around private sector finance as well. And that's why, you know, the UK, for example, is a great leader in green finance and sustainable finance. We need to find ways to help countries get the access to finance that they need to grow these businesses, and to see that they can gain. And I mean, I think, just quickly to wrap up, I think, you know, they gain in 2 ways, both by being able to export more out from their countries so that they gain export revenue, but also to show that their ability to compete in international markets is enhanced because they're using international technologies. So that there's still a feedback loop through that. But we have to make the case, and we have to do the analysis. And I think that question about the global analysis is really important. There are groups doing it, the ITC, UNCTAD, I think the World Bank is trying to do studies to help countries really do an assessment of what their climate-related trade needs are and where their interests lie. And that's something that we can all support, I think, as a way forward on this. They don't all have such an excellent advocate as Rain, for example, and your network in really understanding. You have a high level of awareness in UK business about this issue. You have a well-organized business sector, and you're able to articulate your point of view to the government. And not all developing countries have that on green issues.
And we even sometimes listen. Rain, do you want to add? I mean, this is getting a little bit of a love in here, but Rain, do you want to add anything?
Yes, let me add a few things, and apologies if I repeat views. I did sort of lose sound from the room for a few minutes there, and yes, Ambassador, you're true. There's a danger of us all violently agreeing with each other. But I think, I guess, on this sort of broader question as to, do we need sort of action in in multilateral forums in the WTO and international agreements, or will this happen at the sort of firm level by businesses themselves making commitments and developing some of those technologies? And the reality is we need both, right? We need to use every single lever at our disposal if we have any chance of meeting our commitments under the Paris Agreement. So, I mean, certainly at the firm level, we're seeing a huge increase in businesses making and setting their own net zero targets and the plans to deliver that. And you can see that in the built environment. JLL, big construction company, pledging to ensure that all of the buildings that it builds are comply with a net zero target by 2030. So more ambitious than the UK's national target. And the UN's Race to Zero campaign is seeing a huge number of companies sign up to these pledges. And in the UK, we have the SME Climate Hub, which is a way of sharing best practice and helping walk smaller companies through what they need to make those commitments. And at the CBI, we have our Goal 13 impact platform, where we've partnered with Chapter Zero NGOs and Deloitte to provide some of the best practice between companies and the sharing of knowledge they need to meet Goal 13, that all important climate goal in the SDG. But I think we absolutely do need the multilateral agreements. You need, in the same way you need domestic governments to set out the regulations, we need the regulations at those international agreements. And I think, just a couple to add to some of the previous questions, I think one way to sort of get some of the buy-in from developing countries is I think every country should not just be looking at the emissions they produce in their production, but also in their consumption. Because I think what we don't want from ambitious net zero targets is that we end up sort of offshoring some of those emissions. And I think if we're more transparent about where those emissions come, then that helps to sort of foster the agreement. But and I know Carolyn has said this already, but I think we do need the support for developing countries around, they want access to these technologies, but they do need the finance to deliver that. And some of that is, it isn't only around lending and lending mechanisms, it's also thinking about grant and other support, whether that's through the World Bank or the IMF, but ways in which we can provide support to developing countries to adopt some of these new technologies. I do think this really needs to be done in partnership at a global level.
Thank you very much, Ray. I see we only have about 5 minutes left, but I see a question at the back. Yeah. Then I want to just come to Jean-Marie to finish. Quick question at the back.
It's not so much a question, it's an observation.
That's okay. As long as it's brief, it can be either.
Okay. This may sound a little bit pedantic, but I do think it's important because the way that I'm hearing this discussed worries. Okay, so I've been following this topic of environmental goods for several decades. The first initiative was by APEC in the 1990s to try to liberalize trade in environmental goods. And the door round attempt to have something multilateral started almost 20 years ago. So I think that I'm worried if we start to there's strong centrifugal forces to take on all kinds of things here. So I think there needs to be focused first. Second is that well, I keep hearing people talking about green trade. To me, green trade is very much a term, for example, that industry uses when it's talking about improving the environmental performance of its supply chain. Environmental goods aren't green goods. Most of them are not green goods. A green good would be something like compost, unequivocally good. And a 5-ton electric pickup truck is not green. It may be greener, but it's not green. So, for example, if we are talking about liberalizing trade in climate goods that would help with climate change. One that we might want to consider is electric vehicles, but many countries have very high tariffs on electric vehicles. OECD countries, the EU has its 10% on vehicles. The US 25% on light trucks, which includes SUVs, pickup trucks, utility vans. I could go on, but I'll stop there. But I mean, if you want to look for a contrary opinion, I'll happy to provide one.
Contrarians are good. Challenge is great. So for those of you who couldn't pick that up because you're online, some very kind of from somebody who's been working on this said for several decades, just kind of questioning some of the terms that we use around kind of green trade versus greening trade. What is actually a green good or service in this respect? So it is a fair,
Environmental good.
it's an environmental good. It's fair challenge. I'd like to give the last word to the gentleman to my left, Jean-Marie, Deputy Director General. Over you, sir.
Thank you, Ambassador. I just wanted to react on the two previous questions. The first on, if I understand it correctly, why should we do something here at the WTO on climate change? I just think this is a situation, the current situation, we are doing nothing for climate change at this stage. The Paris Agreement has its own track, and sometimes there is a trade measures coming, and we have. The fact is that we are not succeeding in meeting our target of preventing the warming. So COP26 is going to be about how do we intensify the effort. We can continue like that, but countries are going to intensify their efforts, such as the EU with the CBAM, Green Deal, etc. And you have a trade interaction which is going to come, like it or not, to the WTO in terms of compatibility to the WTO, risk of trade friction. And you can look at it in a positive way also. If we want to intensify this effort, maybe we can leverage it through trade by expanding the market. So there is some sort of economies of scale which will be raising the efficiency, and of course the incentives for the businesses because the market will be growing. So these are two reasons. But you are right, status quo can perfectly be and actually it would suit most of the trade negotiators because there is no new negotiation to start. On the previous question, I think that something, and I would really speak on my personal capacity here, not in secretariat capacity, but what you mentioned is very interesting because we have this vision in the WTO that a trade agreement is a Roman law, hard law agreement, enforceable with a dispute settlement, and which needs at least to have the critical mass if it's not a multilateral one, if it's a plurilateral one. And this is the perfect model for trade concession. I mean, if it's a zero-sum game, fine, you give me that, I give you that. I need to go back to my constituent, show that I have the same value than the other. But when it comes to a public good, like climate change, why not think differently? And there are other models of trade agreement. For instance, the APEC, which has been mentioned, is based on concerted unilateralism. For instance, I heard from Caroline in your initial intervention that the UK has been liberalizing unilaterally some environmental good. So if another country is interested in something, why don't they talk to the UK, and two countries are going to do that together? Isn't that the beginning of a new agreement? And then we can add progressively, voluntarily, to and widen the scope of the countries, and that could be the type of thing which would bring a contribution to solving the public good problem with a different type of norms or approach to the cooperation. The Paris Agreement is based on nationally determined contribution. Is that a model that we could import inside an organization like WTO? I don't know. I'm just trying to react to your question. And thank you, Ambassador, for giving me the floor.
It's a pleasure. And I think it was a very apt way to end and very kind of eloquently put a kind of challenge back to us all, actually, within the WTO and more broadly about our work in this era. So I think we are probably at the end of our allotted time, but I'd like to thank my three very distinguished panelists, both two in the room, but also Rain back in the UK, for a really lively discussion, a really kind of challenging debate on these issues. And I'd like to thank everybody who's joined us, both in the room, including those of you who have asked questions, and those online too. Thank you very much. Big task ahead of us.
Thank you.